One of the main ideas that we use a lot is the idea of solving equations. Well, another way of thinking about solving is like finding an inverse. Now, what inverses are undoing an equation. So what we want to do is understand how an equation is built. So let's take a look at this one. We have f of x is equal to 3 times x minus 1 squared plus 7. If I was to build this equation, I would start with x, and the first thing I would do would be subtract 1. Then my next step would have been to square it, then multiply by 3, then add 7. That's how I built it. So the idea of an inverse is to undo it. So last thing I did was add 7. So the first thing I want to do to undo this equation is subtract 7. Then the next thing I did was multiply by 3. So that was the second to last thing I did. So I got to undo multiply by 3, so I divide by 3. Then the second step we did was squaring. So next thing I've got to undo is the square, so I take the square root. Then the very first step I did was subtract 1. So to undo subtract 1, I add 1. And that gives us our inverse. So you could think about how you basically could have undid it. So I'm just kind of working from the beginning. I started with the 7. I subtracted 7. Then I divided by 3. Took the square root. Then added 1. Now what inverse do is they undo the equation. So if I took this equation right here and I plug it in to the x right here, watch what occurs. Well, first of all, the 7 and the negative 7, they add to 0. The 3 over 3, well, this reduces. So I can cross those guys out. Square root undoes the square. I have x minus 1 plus 1, so I end up with x. So that's what an inverse does. It undoes the function. I get back with what I would have started with, which would in this case have been x. Now sometimes the equations might be a little bit tough to kind of work with. So as a technique, this method always works. So see about exchanging x and y. So we have an equation, in this case it was g of x. And what I'm going to do is realize that g of x is the same thing as saying y. Now to find an inverse, what we need to do is simply exchange x and y. So this becomes y, and this one becomes x. Then I'm going to solve my equation for y. So I want to get y by itself. So now I'm going to start looking at it. Well, the first step I'm going to do is subtract 4. Then I'm going to divide by negative 1 or multiply by negative 1. I need to get rid of this negative. Now when I multiply by negative 1, I'll get negative x plus 4. So what I'm going to do is rewrite this as 4 minus x. Next I'm going to do is get rid of the cube root. So I'll cube both sides. Then I subtract 3. Then I divide it by negative 2. And you might be okay with this, but it's a little awkward with having a negative on the bottom. So I'm going to multiply top and bottom by negative 1. And that will give me negative parentheses 4 minus x cubed plus 3. Well, since the 3 was positive, I'll rewrite it as 3 minus 4 minus x cubed over 2. Then I have my inverse. Now, here's a little shortcut that sometimes it's kind of nice when you have like a negative y term. I'm going to take this term here, move him to this side, and move this guy to the other side. When I exchange sides, they're going to change signs. By doing this, now I've got one last step. I divide by 2, I divide by 2, and I've got my inverse. It's right there. Okay, let's look at one more example. Okay, so we have h of x is equal to the square root of 1/3 x minus 4 to the 5th plus 1. So again, I'm going to exchange x and y. So h would have been y. So I'm just going to do that as my first step. Just exchange it. Undo the square root. We square it. Next thing I've got to do is I need to undo the plus 1. So I'll subtract 1. I want to get rid of the 1/3. So I multiply by 3. Now you may have made this 3x squared minus 3, and that's fine. Get rid of the 5th power. We'll take the 5th root. Final step, we add 4. And then to make sure we recognize that this is the inverse of h of x, we do want to use the correct notation. And we write h inverse of x is equal to 5 times 3 times x minus 1. 3 times x squared minus 1, and then plus 4.